Hello and welcome. My name is Alberta Stevens. I'm a mum of two gorgeous boys who are 12 years old and 12 months old. We live in West London, and when I'm not educating or parenting, I am often studying. I'm doing a master's at the moment for my sins. And I also spend a lot of time crafting resources to help other home-ed moms who are new to the experience, and also helping people just find their own unique and authentic way of home learning. We have been home educating for the past 4 years now, and the last year has sort of been in and out as we sort of navigated between having the experience of starting secondary school and realizing that home ed is the way forward. So today I want to talk to you about an experience that I have really enjoyed in this journey of home education. Being a Christian woman of an ethnic minority background, it was really important to me to find a way of charting an authentic education, or an education that spoke to my identity and culture. So I will be sharing with you how I revised what is, or what's known as, a sort of traditional Western Christian home ed philosophy to adapt and accommodate my own cultural experience. So the title of my talk today is Going Bold and Proud in Morning Time, Recapturing Authenticity and Belonging Through the Ancient African Tradition of Griot Oral Storytelling. Quite a mouthful, so we'll have a go. I walked into home education in 2018 with less than 1 month's worth of research. I had no curriculum, no guiding philosophy. I had no network of friends or support to draw from. I knew literally nobody. I had one friend of a friend whom I did contact and say, please tell me everything you know. Obviously our context was quite different, but she was of great help, and she did point me to different people, but I'd already taken the plunge. I knew my son needed a break from school, and so I took the plunge, and I knew that we'd figure the rest out. So I trawled through the internet. I listened to blogs, I read blogs, I listened to books. I mean, yes, I did listen to books. I listened to podcasts. I read quite a lot myself. And we started this journey. So the only guide I had was the fact that I wanted to piggyback off the existing curriculum that my son was already using at his school, which was a classical education, a knowledge network classical education. And so that sort of helped me navigate where I wanted to go. And so during this frantic period of learning and doing, I came across Charlotte Mason. And I was particularly intrigued because she was sort of singing from the hymn sheet that had been kind of echoing in my heart. And you know when someone puts words to things that you're feeling, so it struck a chord. I started listening, and one day I was listening to a podcast when I came across the idea of morning time. There was one quote that sort of encapsulated the idea of morning time to me, and this is Charlotte Mason saying, give your child a single valuable idea, and you have done more for his education than if you had laid upon his mind the burden of bushels of information. So in this, she's saying that the idea of presenting good ideas to a child and creating a sort of rhythm and a ritual around this value of presenting good ideas. So our role, therefore, as parents is to facilitate this process of presenting good ideas to our children. And I felt there was no better format of context of laying this feast of ideas that Charlotte Mason expresses than a morning time. So once I came across this idea, the shackles of feelings of inadequacy around home education fell right off my feet. Suddenly, rather than approaching each day with trepidation and feelings of worthlessness, thinking, oh my goodness, what am I doing, and dread, I'm not fit for purpose, this is crazy, I'm going to mess up my son, I started feeling excited, thinking, well, I don't really have to do much. All I need to do is present these ideas and discuss them with him, have him narrate back what he's learning, and we're good to go. And so I began to feel that if I've done 1 hour of successful morning time, that's sufficient education for the day. Okay, yeah, we did a little bit more. You know, I'm an African parent. Education is really important, particularly academic education. So we did a lot more than that, but it was just that there was an easiness that came to home learning once we got this format of morning time down to a T. So what do I mean by morning time? I'm sure most of you know, but anyway, for anybody who doesn't know here, morning time is that space that we create, or parents, whether in home education or traditional schooling, that a learning family sets aside to present the learners with a menu of ideas, exquisite ideas that are either read aloud or sung or recited, that bring meaning and connection, right, that foster the sense of shared knowledge amongst the learners and the learning, or within the learning community. Some people call it circle time, other people call it family time. Morning time isn't necessarily ever done in the morning, so it'll be done in the afternoon. It could be done in the evening. It could be in the afternoon. Some people call it tea time, or poetry tea time, even though that is specifically to do with poetry. But if you like, it could be what schools term assembly time. It's that sense-making, inspirational time in the day when you look at different pieces of information, well, I wouldn't say information, ideas that feed and furnish the mind, that then lingers through your thought process over a period of time. I loved the idea of morning time, and I then started to cultivate this ritual in our days where I'd bring a mix of secular and sacred songs and hymns and folk songs and poems and fables and parables and read aloud. So we'd take a book and we'll serialize it over a period of time. I slavishly hoarded all the recommended traditional books like Shakespeare, Grimm's fairy tales, Aesop's fables, English folk songs, traditional hymns. I did it. It was beautiful. We loved it. It kind of just was a follow on from all the sort of cultural things that we often do, but in piecemeal basis. But now we could sort of have this buffet of ideas every day. Suddenly, especially as we started reading Aesop's fables religiously, it began to dawn on me that I had experienced this sort of family-based story form education before. It dawned on me that my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was totally illiterate, couldn't read or write, but was arguably the person that I learned everything I know about being, you know, a family woman, being a stay-at-home mom. And these ideas that I'm fastidiously relearning through books now, that person was in fact my grandmother. She was a griot. She was my morning time, even though she did it in the evening, my storyteller. But more about my grandmother a bit, because this is essentially about what I learned from her and how I incorporated that back into my homeschooling. So who are griots, and what do I mean by that, and why is storytelling important? Griots were the keepers of stories. They were the keepers of the significant historical parts of their culture, genealogies, values, and cultural norms within their communities. Griots is the name given to storytellers within the African tradition, particularly in West Africa. They didn't only tell stories, they recited poetry, they sang songs, and therefore they were the shapers of the cultural norms and values of their communities. Griots were powerful people. They were the custodians of the atmosphere of their communities, and much like home-ed mums or dads, if you like. And very well, I would say every well-documented cultural mythology or history has a name for griots. In Norse mythology, they were called bards, and the famous Bragi, the Norse god of poetry, of course, we know, began that process, which is why Shakespeare is called the Bard of Stratford or of an Avon. The Scots and Irish call their griots shonachais. Greek and Roman mythologies had famous storytellers like Aesop and Homer. In modern times, I would argue that C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Harry Potter's author, I've forgotten her name, J.K. Rowling, my son just whispered, Shakespeare would possibly count as the shonachais of our modern times. Stories are important. Stories are so important. We have names for the people that tell our stories. Charlotte Mason says that children should have the joy of living in faraway lands, in other persons and at other times, a delightful double existence, and this joy they will find for the most part in their storybooks. I agree with her. So I began to think, well, if my son was to escape to faraway lands and pretend to be other people, then it was really important that his imagination was also filled with stories that embodied his own ethnic heritage and values. So once I made the connection between my grandmother's stories and the practice of morning time, or Aesop's fables, for example, I felt empowered to bring more of that, more of my cultural heritage into my classical Charlotte Mason-esque Western education. And I therefore became intentional in channeling my grandmother's stories to my son. Luckily, I didn't really have to go far, because I realized that a lot of the stories that my grandmother had told me weren't exactly my grandmother's stories. In fact, I started reading these books in African myths and folklore. As I bought these books, I realized, well, actually, I know this story and I know that story. Where I don't ever remember studying this. How come these stories sound so familiar? Because I heard them at my grandmother's feet. So I began to infuse my morning time sessions. We didn't stop the poetry reading, Shakespeare or Wordsworth and all the other famous traditional poets. We didn't stop singing the hymns and different songs, but we just had this fusion, and it was no longer a case of getting a cookie cutter kind of education. Home education became personalized. I felt like I could bring myself to that process, and whether I had studied or had a degree in teaching or not, it was irrelevant. I could bring my whole self to the table, and I myself had something to offer my son that was important to who he was, apart from just being his mom. My grandmother was a formidable homemaker. She was a mother of 5. She raised 6 other children, and she had 6 grandchildren who lived with her at one period of time. She was an entrepreneur, a community champion, a counselor, and an extraordinary cook. She started each day at 4 a.m. in the morning with her prayers, and she was out by 9 in the evening like clockwork. Now, I would love to have that kind of discipline today. Even though she was illiterate, she was the best judge of character I have ever known, and she was also the most captivating storyteller. Everything I now desperately long to grasp within my Charlotte Mason homeschool living, I once saw my illiterate grandmother practice but took for granted. When my grandmother told stories, She would wait for the cool of the evening, just before bedtime. She would summon all the grandchildren to come and sit by her feet. The moon would be out, and we'll be sort of all fluttering around, doing our own thing, and she'll call every single one of us. One person first, go and call that person, and each person will go and call the others. Before long, she'll have all her 6 grandchildren sitting at her feet, and then the teenagers in the house will come flocking in as well, and they'll bring their friends, and then all the neighbors' kids will come along, and before you know, we'll all be sitting in the veranda around my grandmother, and she will start to tell her stories. She told 3 different types of stories. Well, I would say 2. The other one was mostly my cousins, because we all had a go. Her 2 favorite genres were this. There were stories about beautiful girls who always married wrong, or poorly, or badly, if you like. They were picky, fussy girls who never listened to their parents' advice. They were very shallow or vain, and invariably they will turn away so many suitors, and they will go for the shiniest, spunkiest, funniest, seemingly richest man, who ended up devouring them one way or the other. I would roll my eyes at these stories and think, but I wish I'd listened, because there was a lot in those stories that could have saved me a whole lot of headache. But this talk is not about that. My favorite stories, however, were the stories she told about Breast Spider. Breast Spider was this prankster, mischievous character who always found himself in trouble, but could always worm his way out of trouble by the skin of his teeth with his wits. So I want to tell you one of these stories that my grandmother told me, just to give you an example of how I began to incorporate that into our morning time. So here goes. With African griots, before they start, they'll do a call and response. So it'll go like this. I say in and you say out. In. You say out. In. And then I'll say story go. This is Griot. And then you say story come. Story go. Story come. Meaning the story goes out and the story comes back. The story goes out and the story comes back. And it's a bit like it's a relay, right? And we pass this on. It's a heritage, a cultural heritage. A story goes out and the story comes back. And then she'll start. Once upon a time, long ago, or if you're like my son, my friend's 3-year-old son, you kind of blend them both together and you say, once ago, there was Breast Spider. He lived in this village with his wife and children. One day, his darling wife said to him, Breast Spider, I need you to take something over to my mother in the next village. Breast Spider was very reluctant to go, of course. So Breast Spider said, I'll go, but if I'm going to go on this journey for you, you need to do something for me. Make sure you cook my special dish before I go. So his wife knew how to butter up her husband, so she cooked his special meal for him, laid it out nicely. Breast Spider had eaten to his heart's content. So he got up on his journey and went on his way. But Breast Spider is known for being greedy. He's never full. So Breast Spider made his way to his mother-in-law's house. He was within a stone's throw of the house when he began to smell the aroma of this most delicious jollof rice. Jollof rice is a staple meal across West Africa. So Breast Spider thought, are my senses deceiving me, or can I smell jollof rice? Now he knew his mother-in-law's cooking was the best of the best, but you obviously can't say that to his wife. So Breast Spider began to lick his lips as he smelled all the spices and ingredients of the jollof rice. could smell the tomatoes, he could smell the thyme, and he could smell all the lovely spices coming through from this dish. As soon as Spider got to his mother-in-law's house, he heard a commotion, and his mother-in-law was right there, cooking. She was, and obviously it was hot. It was a hot day, and in Africa and village, people cook outside and by the fire, 3 firestone, and she was, wiping the sweat off her brows, stirring the pot. My Spider came and said, "Mama, what's wrong?" And Mama was like, "I'm so glad you're here, Spider. I'm in the middle of cooking, but I've heard that there is, trouble next door, and I need to go see if my friend is okay. So please take this pot and keep on stirring. Don't stop. And I'll be back." So Spider said, "Of course, I'll be glad to help. Leave it with me." So the mother-in-law ran off. Spider took the pot, began to stir the stew and the rice together. He tasted to see, when you cook, you have to taste. So my Spider tasted a bit. Lovely. He eyed a piece of chicken. Let's try that. Lovely. A bit of meat. Beef. He tried that. And before you knew, the Spider kept tasting, and all the meat in the pot was gone. No more. He started stirring again, and he started eating the rice. And before you know, the rice was gone. There was hardly anything in the pot but the crust. Suddenly, he heard his mother-in-law running back. "But Spider, how are you? How's the cooking?" As soon as he could hear her coming from the distance, he thought, quick, what are we going to do? She cannot see the pot." So Spider decided, in his infinite wisdom, that the best thing to do was to put the pot on his head and find an excuse as to where the pot had gone. But Spider took the pot, put it on his head. He had a hat. He put the hat on his head. And as soon as his mother-in-law came, mother-in-law was like, "But Spider, what happened? Where's the pot?" "Oh, Mama, something happened. There was something, and thought of an excuse. A lion was coming in to the village, and so he decided that he'd put the pot away somewhere. Pot is on his head. Pot is beginning to burn him, and then Spider starts moving his head like this, because obviously his head is burning and his hair is singeing, and he's thinking, "Oh my goodness, what do I do?" And his mother-in-law, "But Spider, what's wrong? Why are you moving your head like this? Like this? And he said, "Mother-in-law, don't you know what day today is?" And his mother-in-law, "No, I don't know what day is. Today, mother-in-law, is a day for shaking your head." Mother's like, "What? I haven't heard of this before." My Spider's like, "Yes, mother-in-law, today is shake day. Mother-in-law, today is shake day." And he was singing, and backing his way out the house. "Mother-in-law, today is shake day." So Spider shook his head out of that situation and out of the compound. Until today, Spider has no hair on his head, because he put the pot on his head and the pot singed all his hair and was about to scald him. So began a journey for my son and I of Griot's oral storytelling, where we'll tell the story, a very short story that had a moral to it. And I'm not going to begin to analyze that to you, because I'm sure that is self-explanatory. And there will be songs that went, and obviously this song that I just sang to you had the same rhythm, but obviously when I'm telling it to my son, I'll sing it in Griot. But I wouldn't want to have to interpret it for you, so I just sang it in English, but it was pretty much the same tune. And in this process, the fruit of just introducing these stories that I learned as a child to my son was endless. But what's interesting about the brass spider stories is that they are common across West Africa, South America, and the Caribbean. Africans used to tell these stories. They started off originally in Ghana, known as the Brown Nancy stories, and these stories were taken by Africans who were transported to the Caribbean and America, and they were told as a way of usurping the tyrannical powers of slave masters on the plantation. So Africans used to tell each other's stories as a way of empowering themselves and finding ways to trick their treacherous, inhumane slave masters. And so you see that even though the spider is small and mostly insignificant looking, he was crafty and he knew how to outsmart all the big animals, everybody around him. He was greedy, he was lazy, and so he had to learn how to survive by his wits. Many stories tell of the spider always outsmarting people, but what is interesting about African oral storytelling, or the breast spider oral storytelling, is that there's always a cost to pay when you survive by your wits or you survive by trickery. Thus showing that, you know, one has to learn from consequences, that you might get away with fooling your mother-in-law temporarily. There's a cost, such as losing your hair. And as we began to look at these stories over a period of time, we began to find similar characters like breast spider, obviously in Aesop's fables, but also in mainstream Western education, characters like Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, or Loki, the god of mischief in Norse mythology, very much like breast spider, or the mouse in the Gruffalo. Think about it, small, you could argue insignificant in comparison to the Gruffalo and many of the other animals. I mean, he was seen as food, but he used his wits to trick everybody around him. Enid Blyton's Brer Rabbit, or Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox. All of these characters remind me of the breast spider character, shrewd, sly, cunning, always surviving by their wits. You don't have to be a griot or a Shonkai to be to tell your child a story. You don't have to officially be a performer. I suspect that you have been reading stories to your children from birth, and you'll continue to do so whether you home educate or not. There is enough research out there to show that reading aloud to children is very important for them, and it's good for them even way beyond teenage years. There is something powerful about the voice of a parent communicating wonderful, lofty ideas, you know, whether it be in poetry or for books, to their children, that makes the ideas familiar to the child because it's coming through the voice of the parent. It no longer seems like something over there. Education, learning then becomes something that is, you know, within the home. So practically in my home, I started out, often I would read or I would tell the story, narrate the story. Obviously I have to have practiced it myself, reading it, and then I'll make it up. You know, I don't read it word for word. If it's an African story that I knew already, I will tell it. If it's something that I don't know and I'm unfamiliar with, I will read it out loud. I'd probably read it with an accent, or sort of mimic it in either way. I'll try to bring the story alive with my personality. It's only my child, so I can be as silly as I want. I would also ask my son to retell the story, and for a long time he was an only child, so role play was one of the ways I sort of hooked him into our learning, by letting him have a go, so it's not a done to process. It was both of us were participating and owning the agency of his learning. So I would also get him to try and narrate the story to me in a griot style, of course. And this will improve his memory, it improves his confidence. So there's a lot of learning benefits that come out of the process. We would also reenact the story. We'll try and sort of maybe put on something. I just put on a hat there with a little pan on my head. And we will sing the songs, and this is my best part, when we'll learn the songs, and we'll learn the songs in the original language of the song. Whether it wasn't only African stories that started coming into our home, we would read stories from all over the world, South American stories, stories from the Caribbean, Russian folklore. Wherever I would find stories that were interesting, that had a sort of moral imagination, that will be brought into our morning time. We'll also discuss the moral of the story. I often try to draw out what he got from it. Often it will be something very obvious, and then I'd ask further questions, and we'll go deeper and deeper. And that's a very important part of the story, the whole process for me. Over time, I began to see delight in this experience. I began to see a deeper connection between my son and I began to see that he felt that he belonged to the culture that my mother and I were raised and shaped out of. As he started retelling the stories, he began to own them and felt like they were his stories too. He took an interest in my grandmother. He took an interest in the context I spent my first 7 years in, what it was like to live in a big house with lots of cousins and older aunties and uncles, right? And that's something he's never experienced, being an only child. So he took an interest in the context of what it's like to run around in the evening in the light of the silvery moon, and sort of run around between cornfields and playing hide and seek. I can't say my words right. Playing hide and seek in that context, right? So and increasingly I saw that my son started taking an interest in wanting to speak Griot, which is my language, my mother tongue, and he took great delight in sharing what he had learned in morning time with my mum, who, you know, obviously just found it so moving to see her grandson, who was born in the Middle East and is growing up in the UK and has hardly ever been to her hometown, has now taken an interest in speaking her language and telling the stories her mother told. So there is an intergenerational connection that has come out of this experience of bringing my whole self, my cultural experiences, into my education journey with my son. If you think this is something that's only applicable to immigrant families, which you might want to think, it's easy to dismiss what I'm saying as, oh, well, it's good for you. You need it, I don't. Think again. I think stories inform who we are. Stories inform our identity. Stories inform our purpose. They set out our imagination. We get a sense of where we fit in the world from stories. You ask any 4-year-old who they want to be, they will tell you without reservation who they want to be based on a character. Stories are important. And if we want to be inclusive, wholesome people, then it's important that we tell stories from different diverse cultures, stories that open windows and mirrors into different parts of the world to our children. My son had struggled in school for many years because a lot of what he saw around him did not reflect who he was. And these were some of the things that I had wanted to explore by home educating him. And so when I found this path that allowed me to bring not only my culture but also my faith in my education while still holding on to the canon of Western education, I felt like I had been empowered as a parent. I felt empowered to be bold in my in what I was doing in educating my son. So I want to encourage you to do the same. If you are someone from different culture, or perhaps you're dominant, white, Christian or non-secular, go out of your way and introduce different stories and fairy tales from different cultures. There are so many resources online. You don't even have to buy books. So many folklores and fairy tales that are online that are from different parts of the world, and you will soon find that a lot of the stories that we tell have influence. There's a cross-cutting theme, or they are very, very similar, and the stories have just been passed around. So I want to encourage you to do that. And if you feel that that's too much, I've also developed some morning time resources that are culturally diverse, that bring in these stories, bringing folk songs, that bring in all these different resources that make on a beautiful feast of morning time ideas. They can be found on my website at homegrownsunshine.co.uk. It's one word, and sunshine is spelt with an O, as in sun, boy, child. So homegrownsunshine.co.uk, and my resources are called A Liturgy of Love. I can be found at on Instagram at homegrown.sunshine. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.